It's Joyce Pellino Crane here at WestfordCAT Studios. I have a little bit of a hoarse voice today, so I hope you'll bear with me. I'm sitting here today with Sue Hanley, who is a mental health advocate and also a school nurse at the Stony Brook School in Westford. I wanted to welcome you, Sue.
Thank you.
And thank you for coming, because our topic of discussion today is a sad one, but one that I know you are very passionate about and interested in speaking up about. It's suicide. And the reason why we're talking about it is because there have been two recent high-profile suicides in the news within the past week and a half or two. We're taping this today on June 14th, 2018. And so in the wake of the suicide of Kate Spade, the designer, and then Anthony Bourdain, who was the food guru, I guess you might want to call him. I thought if it's happening on the national level, it's probably happening on Main Street. And so I wanted to touch base with you and see what you're thinking about these high-profile situations and how they may be impacting people in Westford.
Well, every time there's a high profile like Robin Williams, there'll be a lot of news about suicide and about suicide prevention. And while the death of somebody obviously saddens me, I'm always grateful when there's more discussion about it. You know, suicide is a topic that makes people very uncomfortable, and yet we need to talk about it. So when that happened and it was back-to-back two different people, I was stunned, and yet ironically, and I had mentioned this to you off camera, the day before Anthony's death, there was an article in the paper, in the Boston Globe, saying that it was talking about suicide rates, and one of the highest incidents of suicide rates right now is in middle-aged men.
Let's talk about that. So when they say middle-aged, what is middle-aged now?
I know. I'm not really sure. I guess I want to think it's 45 to 65. I mean, that's what I think about. I think especially for men, it's a very difficult topic, because depression is something that especially men, I think, feel it's a sign of weakness. And so I think a lot of people live with this dirty little secret, I like to call it, and it saddens me that we can't talk openly about an illness that is so prevalent. 20% of adults will suffer from a mental health illness, and it just saddens me that often people don't even realize the person was suffering until they take their lives.
It often happens that way, that you had no idea this person was suffering the way he was or she was.
Yeah. Well, I did read a little bit about Kate Spade, and it said she'd been, I think, under treatment for depression. I don't know. But isn't that interesting that every time I've ever read anything about Kate Spade, I never saw any information about her suffering from mental health issues. I've always been grateful when a celebrity will be honest with what's going on with them, because that helps people, that it just helps with the destigmatization of the illness, Right. So, and it's just a shame that we find out about somebody's illness after they're gone, Right. She put on this beautiful, happy face to the world, and yet obviously inside she was struggling. And I think it's a wake-up call for people who think, well, if you have money, you have status, what would you have to be depressed about? As though it's a choice, right? And so I think when somebody a celebrity takes their life, it does make people stop and think a little bit more about how real mental illness is.
And how serious depression is.
Yeah.
Which, before the cameras started rolling, I was telling you how I never realized just how serious depression is. And I don't know how you convey that. I mean, now I get it, but how do you share that or convey that to other people, that depression is just so debilitating?
Yeah. Well, I think there has to be education everywhere. I think we need to be talking about it obviously with students at school, we need to be educating our educators. Police officers need to be educated, first responders, doctors, nurses, med students. I mean, when you really think about it, if everybody had a little bit more education about signs and symptoms and what to look for, maybe there'd be more people being diagnosed. There's a statistic, I've done some work with NAMI, the National Alliance of Mental Illness, and there's a statistic out there when we talk about youth and depression, and the average age of treatment, the average delay in treatment, I should say, it's 8 to 10 years between the signs of symptoms and before a person actually gets treatment.
Why is that? Is that because they're denying, or because there aren't enough facilities, or a little bit of both?
I think people are in denial very often. Again, I come back to that place of, well, what do I have to be depressed about? You can have kids that come from good families and are smart and athletic, and so inside they might be struggling, but to the outside world they put on that happy face because it doesn't make sense to them, And then I think it's hard as a parent to recognize when your child is struggling. I've always been very open about my daughter's struggle with depression and suicidality, and it was hard at first when I realized what was going on. And I have a history of mental illness in my family, and I'm a nurse. It was still a struggle to see it in my child.
How long did it take you to acknowledge it to yourself?
Fortunately, it was just a couple of years, meaning, in hindsight, looking back on the beginning of when she was symptomatic until diagnosis. But for her, she didn't accept it. I accepted it by the time she was a freshman in high school, when things really became apparent, and I knew that's what we were dealing with. But it took her a couple of years before she would, even through some very difficult times, it took her until her senior year, after a second suicide attempt, until she finally acknowledged that she truly was suffering from depression. And that's tough. That's tough.
That's very tough. It must have been very hard for you and the whole family.
It was, yeah.
But she got help. I remember, because I've written one article about her.
Yeah, she's an amazing young woman,
Yeah.
and she's a teacher now in Somerville. She's a 4th grade teacher, and she's still under treatment. It's depression can be a chronic illness.
Right.
And she's still in therapy, and she's still on medication. And yet it is one of those, I'm incredibly proud of her that she allows me to talk about it,
Yes.
because I think that stigma still, oh my gosh, well, what happens if somebody finds out? Well, we wouldn't say anything if somebody had diabetes or any type of cancer, or
Right.
it's so sad to me that mental illness still has that very poor image.
Right.
And with treatment, people can live a normal, healthy life. They can,
And your daughter is a perfect example of that.
Exactly.
So that's great.
Yeah.
Is it mostly a white disease?
No, I don't believe that. I think you see it in minorities, and I don't think there's any group of people that are not affected by it.
Yeah.
I think culturally, there are certain cultures that find it more difficult to acknowledge that a child might be struggling with a mental illness. But I don't think anybody's immune from this disease. I really don't.
It's just that sometimes I think about people who are really struggling in Syria and refugee camps, and
How are they resilient?
They don't have the luxury almost of being depressed. I don't know if that makes sense, but whereas we have this beautiful life here in Westford, with rolling hills and a green common, just lovely residential streets, and why?
Well,
Why isn't it enough?
again, a lot of it is endogenous. I think, again, we forget that, there is definitely a genetic factor to mental illness. Not all cases. I think technology has created some problems, and sometimes some kids, I think the cell phone has been problematic. It's like every technology has wonderful parts to it, but there's always downsides too. And when we think of youth, they don't know it, they don't know it any different, right? I mean, we look back to when we first had cell phones and we had the big, remember the box,
I
right?
do. I had it in my minivan with my little babies in the back.
Exactly, and now kids have had it. Kids start having cell phones when they're in 4th or 5th grade.
Right.
But we think about the brain development, which doesn't occur until 25. They say now, I was at a course at one point, and they say for men it's 28. And so they're given a device that their brain hasn't fully developed. So I don't know, I struggle. I struggle with some of the things that go on with the cell phones. And I think it leads to a lot of stress and anxiety in kids and adults. I mean, we're all guilty. I'm guilty. I have my cell phone with me a lot. But I think the younger generation doesn't have a break from it at all,
From the technology.
From technology.
Are you worried about cyberbullying or just the usage of the phone in
I
general?
think a little of both. I think kids don't, even for example, if a child is struggling, right, and we have a face-to-face conversation, you're going to pick up on things much more than you would with a text or a,
That's true.
And so I think that's lost, maybe more kids would be identified because they do tend to share more things with their friends than they would with their parents, right? But I think even friends miss signs because so much of it is behind a screen, I don't know, and obviously cyberbullying is an issue, but I really do believe it's more of the fact that I'm very big into mindfulness and, having just time to just be.
Right.
Instead of, things firing at all times of the day and night. I mean, most kids have their phones in their bedrooms, right? And there's no break.
There is no break. The other thing I've noticed, this was not my own kids' experience because I was a stay-at-home mom, so we had a lot of leisurely, luxurious days where, not every minute was scheduled. But I see a lot of teens who were raised by parents who worked, and they were in daycare a lot.
Yeah.
And even as young adults, the teens are very scheduled. Their days never seem to stop.
Yeah.
I mean, from Saturday to Sunday, and every single minute is booked.
Yeah.
And then after school, and I just worry.
Well, the other thing I worry about too is, and this is one thing that I find is, I work as a middle school nurse, and I am always shocked by the amount of kids that will text their parents from the bathroom, for example, that they don't feel well, and then the parents just show up at the school. And what worries me is that we're not teaching children skills on how to be resilient and how to be self-sufficient and how to figure things out. I think we're seeing more and more problems with suicide and depression in college because all of a sudden they're on their own, and they haven't even learned the skills that they need, And so that's another thing I have a problem with the cell phone with, is that all they have to do is text mom or dad or somebody and they'll be bailed out of a situation. I don't think there's anything wrong with kids having to figure things out on their own.
Right.
We did, and that's what I try to figure out. Why are the rates so much higher now? That's what I come back to sometimes, And that's why, when you talk about Syria or some of these places, and again, I can't even begin to imagine, But first of all, we don't know the scope of what's going on inside these people, right? So I'm sure there is depression. How can you not have some depression? But there's obviously resiliency as well in terms of they've had to struggle through adversities, And obviously, like you said, we're so incredibly blessed here. And that is a struggle for a lot of us to figure out what is going on with our youth, that anxiety is through the roof, I
looked up some numbers. I just want to mention them. So from, what is this? The American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. The second leading cause of death for ages 15 to 34 is suicide. It's the fourth leading cause of death for ages 35 to 44, and the fifth leading cause of death for ages 45 to 54. And that's actually just in Massachusetts. But the second leading cause of death for ages 15 to 34.
Yeah.
Second leading cause.
Yeah. Well, and I'm not convinced that it might be even higher. You know, one of the things that's, you know, sometimes we hear about a single car accident, or I'm not convinced that we have all the facts about suicide. You know, there are some deaths that are associated with a car accident or this accident or that.
Right.
And we don't really know what happened.
That some people can couch their deaths into something that looks like an accident.
Yeah.
Maybe to spare their loved ones, but that
Yeah.
it really is a
Yeah.
suicide.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll never know.
We'll never
for
know.
sure.
Yeah. But you know, again, I think it's just scary for what they're feeling inside, that they would get to that point. And I really do believe that most suicides are an act of selflessness, not selfishness, because I think thinking is often very distorted when you're really in a depression, and you honestly think your family would be better off without you.
Right.
You honestly feel that way.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at a lot of suicides, often there is no note, because I don't think the person has really decided they don't want to live. They have just decided they cannot keep doing what they're doing.
Right.
And you know, I've had the luxury of my daughter surviving 3 suicide attempts, and you know what, I am very well aware that it could have gone the other way.
Right.
And you know, she did all 3 of them by pills, which, you know, boys tend to do it more by hanging or guns. So the rate of suicides, I believe, is actually, I think more girls attempt, or more females attempt suicide, but more boys, I will not use the word successful, more boys end up dying by suicide because of
Yes.
the means that they use.
Yeah, because it's a more violent
Yeah.
approach
Yeah.
to it.
Yep.
Yeah.
I remember years ago going to a conference on suicide across the lifespan, it was called. It was in Sturbridge. And there was this unbelievable speaker. His name was Kevin Hines, and he survived a jump off the Golden Gate Bridge. Did you ever hear his story?
I think I've heard his story on the radio.
Yeah.
Go on, tell it.
It's just,
Yeah.
it's a fascinating story. And he jumped, and he's one of the few people who not only survived, but didn't really break any, you know, he had minor injuries.
Yes.
But what's interesting when he does his talk is that he said as soon as he jumped, he regretted what he did.
He didn't want to do it. He
Yeah.
didn't want to die.
He didn't want to die.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And I really honestly believe that's the case for most suicide attempts. I don't believe they really want to die. I really believe they just haven't figured out a way to live, you know?
Or they just want some peace from
From what they're feeling at that moment.
slings and the arrows of
Yeah.
life, because life is
Oh, it's hard.
hard.
Oh.
And people can be brutally mean
Yeah.
without even meaning to
Yeah,
be mean.
yeah.
Or they can just be rejecting of others. You know, I think the cruelest thing that happens to some people who are maybe a little odd or off or quirky or different is they get ignored.
Yeah, yeah.
And what greater insult can you give someone than to just look through them?
Right. And you know what, though? Everybody's, you know, even ERs, doctors and nurses are guilty. And I'm a nurse. You know, I'm horrified by the way we treat each other, you know?
Yeah.
And you know, none of us are perfect. But if we could all just really remember that everybody has a story to tell,
That's right.
You know, and that a little kindness can go a long way.
A
Yeah.
long, long way.
Yeah.
Just never assume that someone else's life is better than yours,
That's right.
or don't even try to equalize
Right,
that.
right.
Just never assume that that person doesn't have something
Right,
going on.
right.
That's a hardship.
That's right. Yeah, I very much agree.
Yeah.
So.
I looked up so the Youth Risk Survey is due out this afternoon, this very day that we're recording for 2018, but I have 2017, the report in front of me from 2017, and it says that nationwide, 17.2% of students had seriously considered attempting suicide during the 12 months before the survey. 17.2%. That's a high number.
That's a and you know what? If you take the 17% and you actually put it into, I think we can see a percent and say, well, 17%. There's still, 83% that don't feel that way. But then if we actually break it down, and we take, say, our Westford numbers and 17% of youth, that's a staggering number. And that is scary that there's that many kids that think about it,
Right, when their lives should be less complicated.
Exactly.
You know, so that, the complications of adulthood are what we grow into and we get used to, you have to, suddenly you're no longer living in your mother's house and you have to remember to take the garbage out.
Right.
And it's one thing piled on top of another, but we're adults and we handle it.
Yeah.
Children's lives and young teens' lives are not or weren't so complicated maybe in our generation, yours and mine.
Yeah.
But now they seem really booked.
Well, I think kids are overcommitted, but I also think, again, I'm not, it's nobody's fault. One of the things that always will bother me about suicide attempts too, or I know we talked at one point about the show 13 Reasons Why, which really bothered me, because you cannot blame somebody for a suicide. I believe with all my heart that, one person's bullying or that it's usually a culmination of feelings that and maybe there's one thing that triggers that final, I can't take it anymore. But the blaming of people or an individual, I that's what bothered me about that show.
So in that show, the young woman, I think her name is Hannah in the show.
Hannah, that's right. Yeah.
If I remember correctly, because I binge watched it a year
me too,
ago
over the summer,
after we spoke about it. I believe she sent letters or
13 cassettes, remember? Cassettes, yeah.
To 13 different kids in her high school. And was she blaming them, or was she saying,
I think
don't feel bad?
No, it was definitely not don't feel bad. It was almost as though they were part of the problem and why she took her life. And that's I think the main reason that really bothered me.
Yeah.
I was grateful that there was discussion about suicide, but if anything, I felt as though that show, I don't want to say glorified it. I don't think they used,
she was so beautiful, Hannah, that it kind of made it glamorous in some strange way.
And like the staff looked stupid. I'm sorry. There were certain adults in the show that were made to look like they had no concept. So some of the things, there were definitely warning signs.
Right.
And I think the fact that nobody picked up on any of the warning signs, that bothered me.
Especially her parents.
Her parents and people at school.
Yeah.
There were, again, but...
Because she reached out for help, I think, a few times.
Exactly,
right?
exactly.
As I recall.
Yeah. But...
Well, so there's a program in the high school, I'm wondering if it's in the middle school too, called Challenge Success.
Oh, it is in the middle school, yeah.
Can you tell us a little, is that meant to help with some of the stress and anxiety that children are facing?
It's trying to figure out, there's been all kinds of professional development about it, and trying to figure out what is causing the stress in the kids. And it's talking about, taking back, diminishing homework on weekends or different things like that. I think it's a great idea, to try to figure out, but I still wish there was more education about mental illness. I mean, that's just going to always be my bone of contention with how high our statistics are. And I just feel as though there's certain programs, in the middle school we do an SOS program, which stands for Signs of Suicide. Mm-hmm. We do it for 7th graders. And then there's another program in 9th grade that they do for, about depression awareness. And I know the health classes do a good job. But I think staff need to be educated more. I think there is not enough education done for what are the warning signs, and how can we help some of these kids out? How can we recognize it and get them the help? We have Interface in this town, and
Right.
and we have services available to help families. And if the teacher notices a child struggling, they don't have to do anything but let somebody know, and then just treat that student hopefully like they treat every other student, with kindness and empathy.
What if you're a police officer dealing with a mental health issue, and it's a potentially dangerous situation?
Again, and I don't know what kind of training police officers have, but it does strike me that if you call 911, and I've certainly called 911 on several occasions for my daughter, or somebody has on my daughter's behalf, the first person who arrives every time is the police officer. And they should have more training than anybody.
Right.
When you really analyze it.
Right.
Because I think a lot of situations end up escalating because it's not recognized as that's what's going on. And again, I admire so much police officers and what they have to do and the dangers that they face and all that. But I do wonder if some of the stats could be changed with people that are arrested versus maybe getting mental health services, and whether we might see some improvements in care. I mean, and the system in general is difficult. I mean, there's not enough providers. There's not enough beds available out there. I mean, so this is a huge issue. It's not just a localized issue. This is something that the government needs to really be taking a look at. Mental health.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So.
Excuse me. We only have about a minute left, so I just wanted to give you a chance to cover anything else that you would like the community to know. Is there anything you would like parents to know?
Yeah. I think the big thing is keeping your eyes wide open. And if something doesn't seem right, don't blame a grade, a teacher. Try to really figure out what's going on. I was at something once, and the person doing the presentation used 3 little words: "Tell me more." And that's something to think about with anybody that we come across. Tell me a little bit more about what's going on.
I love that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sue, for coming today.
Well, thank you for having me. I
And,
appreciate it.
Just real quick, what's the Interface website for help?
It's www. Interface. Oh my gosh, it's through.
We'll put a slide.
I'm sorry. It's through. It's a college in Newton right now. The name keeps changing.
Oh, and like Pine Manor.
No,
or
it's
something, but
Interface. Oh my gosh, I'll remember as soon as the camera goes off.
Yeah, we'll put a slide up,
Yeah.
and we'll get it.
If you just Google Interface referral service, it will come up. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
For WestfordCAT News, this is Joyce Pellino Crane. Have a great day.